When Madeleine McCann disappeared, the world held its breath, but the true shock came afterward, because this case not only revealed a crime, it exposed the darkest side of all of us. Get ready to face disturbing truths that will change the way you view society. If you, like me, feel the need to understand what hides in the shadows and unravel mysteries that challenge everything we know, subscribe to the channel now and activate the notification bell. Here, every investigation is an opportunity to confront truths that many prefer to ignore. When Madeleine McCann disappeared, the world stopped. But behind the initial shock, there was something deeper, something that wasn't just in the investigation or the conspiracy theories. This case, so cruel and inexplicable, ended up becoming a disturbing reflection of who we are as a society. Because in the end, the disappearance of a girl exposed much more than the failures in finding her. It revealed a dark side, one that we avoid facing, but that was always there. If there's one thing the Madeleine case laid bare, it was the destructive power of sensationalist media. From the start, her disappearance ceased to be a search for justice and became a spectacle. The cameras weren't just there to tell the story, they were there to create a circus. Every day, a new culprit was suggested, a new narrative constructed, often without any basis in reality. For Kate and Jerry McCann, the tragedy of losing their daughter was compounded by public humiliation. The press, hungry for audience, began to treat them not as victims, but as suspects. Theories that the parents themselves might have covered up a domestic accident took over tabloids, spreading doubt and hatred that impacted not only the couple, but the entire search for Madeleine. This kind of judgment was not only cruel, it was dangerous. Every unfounded theory diverted resources and attention from what truly mattered, finding Madeleine. More than that, it revealed a dark truth about ourselves. We live in an era where suffering is transformed into entertainment, and behind every click or bought headline, there's an incentive to feed chaos and morbid curiosity, regardless of the cost. But the media wasn't the only one responsible for turning this case into a nightmare. From the beginning, the investigation was marked by glaring failures. Failures that raise an uncomfortable question. Was the system really prepared to find Madeleine? The crime scene was compromised within the first hours. The apartment where Madeleine disappeared wasn't properly isolated, and people came and went from the location, erasing potential clues. Documents from that time show that the local police took almost 12 hours to contact Interpol, losing crucial moments to find the girl. And when international spotlight arrived, tensions between Portuguese and British authorities created a climate of mutual distrust that made the search even more difficult. This raises an important point. When the institutions that should protect fail, who is held accountable? In this case, the weight of incompetence fell on the McCann family and, in a way, on Madeleine herself. But the system that should have acted in a coordinated manner, it continued to function as before, with the same loopholes that allowed this mistake to happen. And then came the most relentless trial of all, that of the public. In internet forums, social networks, and even everyday conversations, people split between those who supported the McCanns and those who condemned them. Without any concrete evidence, the internet became a court where everyone had an opinion and no one had responsibility. This behavior was not only a reflection of the lack of empathy, but also of how easily we condemn without knowing the facts. After all, it's easier to point fingers than to accept the frightening truth that a child can disappear without explanation and that it can happen to anyone. The Madeleine case forces us to reflect. Why do we feel the need to blame? Is it a way to cope with fear, or is it simply more comfortable to think that there is a direct culprit instead of facing the reality that sometimes the world is chaotic and cruel? Guardians of the mystery, these questions have no easy answers. But one thing is clear, Madeleine McCann's disappearance was not just a tragedy. It was a window into the worst aspects of society, aspects that remain present to this day. And the question we must ask is not just what happened to Madeleine, but what her case says about ourselves. And this is just the beginning of what we need to face. When I started revisiting this case, I thought I knew everything. After all, who doesn't know about Madeleine McCann's disappearance? But as I delved into the layers of this mystery, I realized something that made me completely uncomfortable, or about who might be behind it. It was about something bigger, something that says much more about all of us than we want to admit. Guardians of the mystery, it's as if we're flipping through a book with torn pages. The most important pages are missing. But even with the gaps, there's something there that we can't ignore. A truth that is not only uncomfortable, but disturbing. This is where the second part of this story begins. And believe me, what's coming next will completely change the way you see not only this case, but also our own society. I said that Madeleine McCann's case was like a book with torn pages. Pages that might contain the answers we so desperately seek. unique. But what if I told you that some of these pages weren't lost by accident? That from the beginning, the details of Madeleine's disappearance were covered by a veil of contradictions, and perhaps even something more disturbing? The first contradiction arises on the night of the disappearance. According to the official version, the windows of the room where Madeleine was sleeping had been opened by the kidnapper, a detail that initially led investigators to believe that someone from outside had entered. But there's something strange about this. The glass showed no marks, and the window alarm, which should trigger if it were forced. One of the first police officers to arrive at the scene reported that the window seemed intact, as if it had never been opened that night. This raises a disturbing question. If the window wasn't used, how did someone get in without leaving traces? Or worse, was someone trying to divert attention to that specific point? But that wasn't the only inconsistency. One of the McCann's friends, who was having dinner with them that night, reported seeing a figure carrying a child wrapped in a blanket, walking towards the beach. This testimony was used as one of the initial bases of the investigation, leading the police to focus searches in that area. However, weeks later, a couple who was in the same location claimed that the figure could have been any father carrying his own child to sleep. Imagine the impact of that. One of the first clues, the one that guided much of the initial search, now seemed not as reliable as previously thought. And with each diversion, time, one of the most critical factors in cases like this, was running out. It's like trying to assemble a puzzle where each piece seems to have been intentionally shuffled. And then there's the record of the timings. Kate McCann reported checking on the children at 10 p.m. and discovering Madeleine's disappearance. Shortly before, another friend from the group had passed by the apartment and noticed nothing unusual. But here's the troubling detail. Witnesses near the resort reported hearing noises and suspicious footsteps between 9:30 p.m. and 10 p.m. in a direction leading to the apartment. This creates a gap in time, a space where something happened, but no one seems to be able to fully explain it. Was the kidnapper there before 10 p.m.? Did he wait for the right moment to act? Or is there something in that interval that hasn't yet come to light? Another strange point involves the sniffer dogs used in the investigation. The dogs, trained to identify smells related to blood and human remains, marked two specific locations, one inside the apartment, near the bed where Madeleine slept, and another in the trunk of the car the McCanns had rented. But here's the question. The car was only rented weeks after the disappearance. These findings were quickly questioned. Experts claim that the dogs might have made mistakes or that the odors could have come from other sources. But the doubt remained. How to explain these marks, especially in a car that wasn't used on the night of the disappearance? And more importantly, why did this controversial evidence become one of the main focuses of the media, while other lines of investigation seem to be ignored? Up to this point, these contradictions alone would be enough to cause discomfort. But what really bothers isn't just the errors or doubts, it's the feeling that somewhere between the testimonies, analyses, and theories, an essential truth was hidden, not just from the police, but from all of us. And this leads us to the next question. Were the inconsistencies and contradictions merely the result of chaos, or is there something darker behind this story, something that everyone prefers not to face? The Madeleine McCann case is not unique in its essence. It carries disturbing similarities with other stories that marked eras, such as the disappearance of Etan Patz in New York in the late 1970s. In that case, just like this one, the public outcry was overwhelming, and time seemed like an unrelenting enemy. But there's something I never forgot about that story. For years, the investigation followed paths that seemed logical until a small clue, buried in forgotten documents, changed everything. This makes me think, is there something in Madeleine's case that was also neglected? A detail that seemed insignificant but might hold the key to the entire mystery? What is more unsettling is that often the truth doesn't hide only in the ignored facts, but in what people choose not to say. In the Etan Patz case, a neighbor seemed to know more than they admitted. However, it took decades for that loose end to be pulled. When it finally happened, the answer was closer than anyone could have imagined. And then I wonder, are we facing something similar here? As disturbing as it may be, there's a crucial difference between these stories. In the past, investigations were isolated, confined to local communities. Today, in cases like Madeleine's, the whole world is watching, opining, judging, creating its own narratives. This turns the search for answers into something even more complicated. Because amidst the noise, can we still hear the truths that really matter? And here's the question that keeps me up at night. If the solution to this case lies, as in so many other stories, in something small, forgotten, what are we overlooking now? It is precisely this gap, this possibility of a lost truth, that makes the connections between the mistakes made in this case and other historical events reveal something that is not just uncomfortable, it's alarming. The Madeleine McCann case carries a troubling peculiarity. The more questions arise, the harder it seems to reach a definitive answer. With each theory presented, the gap between the truth and what was officially eventually revealed only widens. Like in other global mysteries, there's a constant dilemma between the evidence we have and those we may never know. One of the first theories raised, which dominated tabloids and divided opinions, was that Madeleine had been a victim of an international child trafficking network. This was reinforced by the idea that the location of the resort, in an area easily accessible to travelers from various parts of the world, could have facilitated the actions of organized criminals. Witnesses reported seeing strangers circulating around the area in the week before the disappearance, including individuals taking pictures of children at the pool. These details seemed to fit perfectly into a narrative that was both terrifying and plausible. But there was a problem. Despite the reports, no concrete evidence was found to support this possibility. Security cameras did not record enough suspicious movements, and the supposed strangers were not identified. This did not eliminate the theory, but weakened it, leading investigators to look elsewhere. From there, an even more disturbing hypothesis emerged. What if Madeleine had never left the apartment that night? What if something had happened there, even before anyone had the chance to take her outside? This is where the conflicts began to escalate. The sniffer dogs, trained to detect smells related to blood and human remains, marked points inside the room, and later, in the trunk of the car the McCanns had rented. This detail sparked a wave of accusations, both in the media and among the general public, who began to question whether the parents could be involved in the disappearance. Some versions suggested that Madeleine could have suffered a domestic accident and that, in the panic, Kate and Jerry had covered it up. But as with every theory, there were loopholes. The car where the dogs detected the smells was only rented weeks after the disappearance. How would that be possible? Additionally, independent experts stated that the reliability of the dogs, while high, is not absolute. In a case already full of failures and errors, this clue was enough to create doubt, but not certainty. The impact of this theory was devastating, especially for the McCanns. They not only lost their daughter, but were also transformed into targets of a public hate campaign. Headlines called Kate the Ice Mother, referencing her supposed lack of emotion in public appearances. Jerry was portrayed as calculating, more concerned with his reputation than the search for Madeleine. This relentless public trial added a new and even darker layer to the case. It wasn't enough to deal with the disappearance of their daughter. They now had to prove their innocence to a world that seemed to have decided they were guilty. And then came the third possibility, that Madeleine was taken by an intruder, someone who knew the McCanns' routine, knew that the children were left alone at night, and waited for the right moment to act. This theory seemed to be supported by the testimony of Jane Tanner, one of the couple's friends, who reported seeing a man carrying a child wrapped in a blanket, walking towards the beach around 9:30 p.m. But again, there were problems. Tanner couldn't describe the man's face in detail, and her statement was only given to the police hours later, raising doubts about its accuracy. Additionally, a couple who was in the same location claimed to have seen a father carrying his son at the same time, which could explain the scene described by Jane. Each of these hypotheses carries its own contradictions. If Madeleine was taken by a trafficking network, why are there no solid records of suspicious movements? If something happened inside the apartment, how do you explain the smell in the rented car weeks later? And if it was an intruder, how did he manage to enter without leaving marks on the window or door? More than the theories themselves, what makes the case so disturbing is how it reveals the chaos in which the investigation was conducted. None of the hypotheses were treated with consistency or focus. Each new clue seemed to push the investigators away from a solid lead, creating a tangled web of possibilities that only fueled the mystery. And then comes the question that echoes to this day. Is any of these theories actually close to the truth, or are they all just reflections of a broken system where the search for answers gets lost amid sensationalism, pressure, begins to gain a new layer? Because no matter how confusing these theories are, they lead us to a crucial point. The true enemy in this case might not be the culprit we're searching for, but the accumulated mistakes along the way to finding him. Right at the beginning of the case, there was a silence that was never explained. Between conflicting reports, one neighbor mentioned noises in the apartment, while another saw a car parked for a long time with the lights on. Isolated clues that might have changed the course of the investigation if they had been connected. A resort employee claimed to have seen a thin figure leaving through a side door that night, carrying something in their arm. The description matches Jane Tanner's account of someone taking a child, but still, it was ignored. Coincidence, or a piece that was never fitted? And then there's the detail of the lights in the apartment. Some said they were off, others on. It may seem irrelevant, but think, if they were off, who was there? And if they were on, who turned them off? It is in this void of answers that the silence of that night becomes more deafening. The Madeleine McCann case has always been surrounded by details that seem to contradict the official narrative, but it's an information that emerged years later that completely changes the perspective. Something that at first seemed insignificant, but when revisited, brought a layer of complexity that no one expected. In 2020, during a review of the case, a specific suspect began to attract attention: Christian Bruckner, a man with a history of serious crimes, including abuse and property invasion, who at the time of the disappearance lived in a van near the resort in Praia da Luz. He was known to frequent the area, and most unsettlingly, phone records show that he was in the vicinity that night. This raises an immediate question. Why wasn't this name associated with the case earlier? Why did it take more than a decade for his connection to Madeleine's disappearance to be considered? The answer is as disturbing as the mystery itself. During the first years of the investigation, the constant exchange of police teams and the lack of cooperation between Portuguese and British authorities left gaps that were never filled. Crucial information simply disappeared along the way. What makes Bruckner even more suspicious is a report made by one of his acquaintances who claimed that he had made an informal confession about being involved in the disappearance of a girl. But like so many other clues in this case, this also led nowhere. Bruckner was never formally charged, and his defense claims he wasn't in Praia da Luz that night, despite phone records indicating otherwise. And then there's the van, the same one he used as a residence, seen by locals in the area days before Madeleine's disappearance. In 2007, no one thought it relevant to investigate this vehicle, but years later, upon revisiting, they discovered it had been sold shortly after the incident. Could this van hold answers that were never investigated? Another point that complicates the story even more is what was found on one of Bruckner's properties. During searches, the police seized a series of suspicious objects, including pen drives containing disturbing images. The suspicion is that he could be involved in other crimes, possibly following a pattern similar to Madeleine's case. But again, the evidence was indirect, strong enough to raise questions, but not to close the case. This brings us back to the heart of the mystery. If Bruckner is indeed the culprit, how did he manage to operate in such a busy area without being seen? How could someone who was already on the authorities' radar go unnoticed for so long? And more importantly, why do so many loose ends remain to this day? This new perspective, instead of clarifying the case, deepens the mystery even further. Because while Christian Bruckner emerges as a consistent suspect, the fact that he was never formally incriminated leaves everything in the same limbo of uncertainty. Looking back, it's impossible not to think that Madeleine's disappearance is more than an isolated mystery. It's a reflection of how accumulated mistakes, communication failures, and disorder can bury the truth, even when it seems within reach. And this is where the case takes an even darker turn, because for many, it's no longer just about finding Madeleine. It's about facing the fact that even with all the evidence, we may never have all the answers. It's not just about a suspicious man or lost clues. It's about what all of this tells us about the limits of justice and our ability to confront the unknown. But there's something more to this story, something that so far few have noticed, a hidden clue that connects the events in an unexpected way. And that's what makes the next disappear annually worldwide, and only 14% of cases are resolved within a year. In Madeleine's case, even with global attention and massive resources, the outcome was the same: no concrete answers. This not only exposes failures in the investigation, but reveals how systems around the world often fail to protect the most vulnerable. A fact that sticks in my mind is that in 76% of child abductions, the perpetrator is someone close to the victim. In Madeleine's case, this statistic seems to contradict itself. There's no evidence against someone close, but there's also no clear indication of an external intruder. And perhaps by looking more closely at these numbers, an unexpected connection emerges, something that can finally make sense of what remains unresolved. When Madeleine McCann disappeared, it wasn't just the tragedy of a lost child that shocked the world. The true impact came afterward, when the case revealed something that no one was prepared to face: the reflection of our own failures as a society. This wasn't just a crime that went unsolved. It was a window into the darkest side of how we deal with pain, justice, and the unknown. The brutal exposure by the media, the hasty judgments, the institutional failures, all of this showed that often we contribute to bearing the truth instead of unraveling it. And even today, we continue with questions that remain unanswered. Is the truth hidden in some forgotten detail, or perhaps in what we choose not to see? More than a mystery, Madeleine's case is a reminder that our systems, beliefs, and even our actions as a society need to be questioned. Now, I want to hear from you. What was the most impactful point of this story? What does this case say about the way we view the truth? If you've made it this far, comment, "I see the dark side," to show that you followed to the end and are reflecting on all of this. If you have suggestions for other cases that deserve to be investigated, leave them in the comments. I read each one and strive to bring the mysteries that you, guardians of the mystery, want to see here. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue following these stories that challenge everything we think we know. In the next video, we will delve into a new case that promises to be as disturbing as it is revealing. Click on the end screen and come with me. Stay vigilant, guardians of the mystery, because sometimes the darkest side is closer than we imagine.